All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Larry Williams, and I'm the director of the Center for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis, or CARMA as we're known. And we're coming at you today, September 26, 2014, from Detroit, Michigan, and Wayne State University, the co-home of CARMA for the 2014-2015 year. And it's a very special day for us because we have not only our first webcast of the year, but that webcast also happens to be the event where we will be celebrating 10 years of successful webcasts. And in fact, the second of our two webcasts will be our 100th webcast that we've done. And so what we normally do, in addition to the webcasts, which begin at noon, I take the opportunity to have kind of in what I hope is an informal chat with our distinguished presenters, in which we kind of explore some areas related to their background, their current projects, their thoughts about the state of the research methods world. And it's just a real special delight to have joining me today our two webcast presenters who are frequent contributors to CARMA, both in terms of having done webcasts in the past, but also being two of our most popular short course instructors. And so, first of all, let me welcome back to Wayne State James LeBreton. And I say welcome back because not only has he been here before for CARMA events, but he was actually a faculty member earlier in his career.
Thank you.
Good to have you back. And this new academic guy here, Paul Bliese, I say new academic guy because after several years as an extraordinarily successful career as a research psychologist with Walter Reed, he's now joined the dark world of academics, and he's a professor at the University of South Carolina. So it's good to have you back, Professor.
Thanks,
Larry. So let me just begin by asking you to reflect a little bit upon whether there was some particular time in your graduate training where you were like, oh, I like this quantitative and research methods stuff. So, James, how about you start?
I would say it probably actually happened in my undergrad years. So I took a number of statistics courses as an undergraduate.
And this was at?
Illinois State University.
Illinois State.
And so I...
Big-time contributors, supporters of CARMA over the years.
So I did my undergraduate there, and then I stayed and did my master's degree in industrial psychology at Illinois State. And as an undergraduate, I was able to take all the stats courses that were offered, at that level. But then I also took some of these 400-level courses that were kind of hybrid, master's level and undergraduate level. And so that's really when I found that I enjoyed learning about statistics and methods. And then I went on for my PhD at the University of Tennessee and worked with Larry James, who has done a lot of work in methodology and psychometrics and other areas, and just continued that interest, having the opportunity to work with Larry.
Right. I think James and I just missed each other at Tennessee because I think I was there for 1 year and left in the fall of '97, and you arrived.
That's when it was fall of '97, yeah.
All right. So, Paul, how did it happen with you?
So my story is a little bit different in that I actually took undergraduate statistics and pretty much hated it. I would have never imagined in a million years that I would have any interest in statistics. So I didn't understand it. The concepts didn't make sense. I couldn't have told you the difference between a dependent and an independent t-test, after taking the undergraduate statistics. And then it just happened, so I did that, not to, lay blame on any school. I went to undergraduate at Texas Lutheran University, a small liberal arts school. But, that just wasn't a strength in terms of what I got out of that program down there. But then when I got to graduate school, I had an instructor in graduate school who, in the leveling stats course, just explained things in a way that made a lot of sense. So this was at Texas Tech, and all the incoming PhD students had to take leveling stats course, and it just clicked. There was something about the way that he presented the information that made sense to me. I thought it was really interesting. I'd always had a bit of an interest in computers, and so I thought that the ability to do stats and apply it and also work with computers and do the programming part of it really fit together well. I mean, this was back in the Stone Age where we had fax machines and you would do your computer programming on a terminal, and then you'd actually have to go physically over to some other building to get your
output,
stack of printouts like this as you killed trees right and left, to go through and find one or two parameters of interest in the stack of papers along those lines. But it made me believe, my own experience with that the instructor makes a huge difference when you take statistics, and if you have somebody who's excited by it, who really understands it and can explain it to you in a way that you can hear, that it's a good experience.
Yep. So I actually just came back from the Strategic Management Society conference in Madrid, and while I was there I participated in a couple of panel sessions trying to aim at helping doctoral students and junior faculty kind of make that transition. And I made the statement that, what you really have to understand is that it takes more than getting A's in your statistics and methods course to be able to successfully author a quantitative paper that is found to be suitable for publication. So I'd like to ask you guys kind of what is it that's in that gap between what you learn in your statistics training versus what you need in terms of being able to successfully publish. Why don't you start?
Well, I don't know, again, how my own experiences would generalize to others, but in some ways, the publications that I've tried to do within statistics are ones where, to some degree, I'm making sense of a method in a way and trying to re-explain something that makes better sense to me. So often if I'm working in an area and I don't understand something completely, I put the work into trying to figure out how to make sense of it for myself. And in the process, that can often lead to a paper, because I have the belief, whether true or not, that if something confuses me, it probably confuses other people, all right? And so that if I can find a way to make it a little less confusing to me, then potentially I can explain it in a way in a publication that is a little more accessible to other people. So I'd say it's some kind of framework. That's what I've done. And I think that, but I'm not sure that that always generalizes, because there's certainly other ways of doing publications methodologically that would make more of a substantive change in terms of contribution, if you will, introducing a brand new method, making some type of advancement within the theory. But my own experience has been more about just explaining what's out there in a way that potentially makes it a little more accessible.
Yeah. James, how about you?
I think your observation is a good one. When I was in graduate school, I was thinking very seriously about getting my master's degree in statistics, and went and talked to Larry James, who was my advisor at the time, and John Binning, who was my advisor from Illinois State, and got the same feedback from them, which was, it's one thing to get A's in statistics courses, but if you really are interested in methods and trying to make a contribution as a methodologist, you should be spending your time publishing papers, because that shows that you can come in and be successful and teach those courses, and that you understand it really at a different level. And so I didn't get my master's. I opted for a minor in statistics, which required a lot less coursework and allowed me to focus more on projects. And my the early work that I did really came out of questions that I had as a graduate student sitting in a course on employee selection and talking about different regression models that could be used to predict employee performance, and then trying to understand how these different variables in that regression model contributed to our understanding of overall performance, and recognizing that some of the statistics that were commonly used had some problems. And so that kind of, I started to ask questions. Well, how would this statistic compare to that statistic, and what would happen if I had a data set that looked a certain way? Would both statistics point me in the same direction, or would they point me in different directions? And so I approached one of the other faculty members at Tennessee with these questions, and he said, I don't know, we should look at that. And so started working on simulations and other things that would try to address those issues. And you know, I agree with Paul as well. I think having papers that can kind of synthesize a diverse literature and bring together what can be oftentimes a very complicated and confusing literature in a way that might be at least a little bit less complicated and confusing can also be another avenue for publication. Because like Paul, I get confused by things frequently, and if I'm getting confused, I hope that other people are getting confused and I'm not the only one. And if I can work on a paper with someone that would help, you know, get rid of some of that confusion, it's hopefully going to help others as well.
Well, as these guys know, and just as point of information, you know, CARMA exists to sort of serve as a supplement to the normal formal training that occurs for doctoral students. And if you spend much time hanging out with people who are involved in the research process, you find there's sort of a lot of negative feelings about the degree to which scholarly publications these days reflect best practices. So you guys both had different kinds of involvement with doctoral training in statistics and methods, and I'm wondering if you could change the world, if there are some ways that you would recommend to a doctoral program, things that they can change to improve the training of their students as a step towards leading to better quality research. What would that be? The typical kind of graduate curriculum and stat methods. How can we improve that?
Why don't you let James start on
Yeah,
this?
James.
So I was looking down at the table.
I missed
I
that
jumped
cue.
right in
Sorry,
there.
man.
If you don't make eye contact, you're not supposed to get asked a question.
I got a coin.
That's a really interesting question. I think I'm serving on the quantitative committee that we have in our department at Penn State, and one of the agenda items was to think a little bit about what might be an ideal curriculum, quantitative curriculum for the graduate students, PhD students in our department. And it's tough because different areas. I'm in psychology, also management, but I think it's true in either department. Different subdisciplines of psychology and different subdisciplines of management oftentimes rely on different methodologies just to collect the data. And those methodologies may also require different ways to analyze data. So if I have a student in my class who's doing a lot of work with ERPs or MRI sorts of data collection, they may require a different way of kind of compiling their data, cleaning their data, analyzing their data. It could be very different from someone who's just using a survey and an organization and wants to examine how the responses on the survey goes. So in terms of improving it, I think it's not so much that there's a particular set of courses or a particular sequence of courses that I think should be prescribed to all graduate students. I just think having a number of different courses available, so a kind of a breadth of courses, out of a catalog, and you can order whatever you want out of the catalog, is probably a good thing. Just beyond kind of a Stat 1, Stat 2 sequence. So having a course in some sort of multivariate analysis or a multi-level analysis, I think is probably a very good thing. I'm surprised by the number of programs in the social sciences, including management, that don't necessarily have a standalone course on psychometrics or measurement. And if you think about what we do in the social sciences, we conceptualize an idea, and then we have to come up with a way to measure it. And then we use the scores that we get on that measure to draw an inference about whether or not the ideas that we had were correct. And so no matter how good our theory is, no matter how good our ideas are, no matter how forward-looking and insightful they are, if it's predicated upon poor measurement, It doesn't matter how fancy your statistics are, and it doesn't matter how insightful your theory is. And that, I guess that would be one thing that I would be much more inclined to make mandatory, would be a course on measurement. And it should be a diverse course. It should recognize that the different disciplines are going to measure things in different ways. There's not a right way to measure really any one construct, but the focus on measurement is important, in addition to just kind of a catalog of other courses.
Okay. So Paul has kind of had one foot dipping his toes in graduate training over the years before jumping in head first now. So what's your take on that?
Well, so from, the caveat, like Larry said there, from somebody who's been a graduate instructor at a university for 6 weeks now, I'll just share a couple observations. And
yeah, you've done a lot of
I've done a lot with the
doctors,
CARMA and those things too over the years. So one of the things that I've thought a lot about in terms of graduate instruction and thinking about training for statistics is that, as far as I can tell, both within the school where I am down at CARMA in South Carolina, and probably this is true of other programs, although I haven't had a chance to ask around, there's very little emphasis on the data management side of it. So, in other words, the classes are geared to things like regression or SEM or accurate measurement, of course, would be a great one. But it's typically on a topic area. But if you think about a career in statistics, I guarantee that 80 to 90% of the time is actually going to be spent on data management. It's going to be spent on how do you get these big, nasty data sets from organizations, how do you merge them together in ways that are not prone to generate errors so that you actually have clean data when you do it. And that's a huge part of being an analyst in there. So I think there's a real niche in there for courses that are geared, and maybe these courses are done in conjunction with the computer science department or with somebody else, where people are understanding basic programming skills and what's needed to do this. Because, again, my own applied experience in the Army is that when we would make mistakes and we would generate results, it was often not because we didn't understand the statistics, but because somewhere in that data merging and management process would mess things up. So I would like to see, if I could, one of the things that would be put out there would be more emphasis on what you're really going to be doing 80 to 90% of the time. And that doesn't, and I think that would be true whether or not you're going into industry as a consultant or whether you're an academic. If you're an academic, you're still going to have to deal with issues of data management. And the other thing I think would make a lot of sense is that, and this is my own personal opinion, but I'm not a firm believer that one has to really have a firm background in complicated mathematical formulas. And I think that, statistics courses that are geared towards getting the ideas across, and in particular, if their individuals bring their own data and their own interests when they're applying the principles, is a wonderful way to learn. So you can learn regression kind of, in terms of a set of procedures. But if you can learn those sets of procedures on something that's inherently interesting to you, then I think those ideas will stick in there much better. So those would be my thoughts.
Okay. So I did mention it earlier, but James and Paul, you may be aware, I have considerable amount of editorial experience at many different levels and many different contexts, including editorial responsibilities for the Journal of Applied Science and organizational research methods. And I guess I'd be interested in how has that experience changed you in terms either of how you perform your craft as a researcher or how you frame what you're looking to get out of your particular career. And I think that means you go first.
Well, actually, I have an answer to this one.
Okay.
So I have two thoughts on this particular one, having been the associate editor for the Journal of Applied for the last 5 years. So one thought is that there's a fine line between writing up your analysis section so that it's not too complex and it's not too simple. So manuscripts that I see that are overly complex analytically, they turn out to be not as compelling as I think the authors would like them to be sometimes. If the reviewers have to wade through something that's just so incredibly dense, they may not actually believe the results because they may think you're getting these results because you had an incredibly complex analytic strategy. Same if it's too simple. You know, if it looks like you didn't actually understand it or completely model it, you run into the same problem. So I don't know exactly how to define it, but you can almost find that there's a sweet point somewhere in the middle where a manuscript's written up with sufficient complexity that reviewers find it compelling. It's not overly complex, not overly simple. But keep in mind, more complex may really work against you when you submit a manuscript. The other thing is that you really, I found authors shoot themselves in the foot if they just mess up something simple. And the one that I see repeatedly is where they mess up something like dummy codes and effect codes, where they have a variable that's coded, say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's a categorical variable, and they treat it as a vector instead of creating n-1 dummy code. So when you look at their regression table, it has 1 degree of freedom instead of 3 degrees of freedom that's associated with it. And where they don't interpret it correctly, so they're not interpreting category 2 against 1, 3 against 1, 4 against 1. The problem is, if you do mistakes like that, which are basic fundamental regression things that you should have learned, then it raises doubts in the reviewer's minds about other aspects of the manuscript, and they start reading it as other things. So get the basics right when you do it, because it will really hurt you if you submit a manuscript that doesn't do that.
James?
So my editorial experience has been in organizational research methods. So it's the target article is very different than what would typically be published in the Journal of Applied Science. And so we're really looking for papers that would somehow make a methodological contribution. And I think those papers can take a variety of different forms. I think you can come up with something completely new and novel. I don't think that happens very frequently, but if it does, please send it to Lawrence. But I think a lot of the papers that do make a contribution are those that are perhaps comparing different methodologies against one another, and showing when one works better than another, or showing some of the inherent limitations or inherent strengths of particular methodologies that maybe we weren't aware of. I think papers that take something that's relatively new and complicated, and the people don't really understand that well, and so maybe it's something that's going on in a different discipline, biology, they use a particular methodology. And then to be able to say, these are the sorts of research questions that we could be asking that we're not able to ask right now because we're constrained by our method. But these are the research questions that are really interesting, but we don't have tools available to do that, or the tools that we do have available are limited in some way. And then to have a paper that can translate, here's some of the techniques that I've learned from biology or econometrics or another area, and here's how those tools can advance our understanding and our thinking in applied psychology or management. I think those papers are also sorts of papers that can really make an important contribution. And then I think papers that resolve, maybe we understand a technique, we think we do, but people are doing a particular technique 27 different ways, and there's really no clarity in the field about how we should be doing this. And so the example that I always use with that is a paper by Bob Vandenberg and Chuck Lance that they did on examining whether or not certain measurement models were equivalent or invariant across different groups. So if you're doing cross-cultural research and I want to compare one culture to another, or if I want to compare men and women on something, there's an assumption that when I give those questionnaires that they have the same psychological meaning to different cultures, that they work and function the same way across different genders. And their paper didn't invent confirmatory factor analysis, their paper didn't invent issues of measurement, equivalence, and invariance. But what their paper did was review this very broad literature and provide kind of a synthesis of this complicated literature and spelled out a roadmap for people going forward. Here's what we've learned from the literature, and here are some suggestions for how in the future we should kind of agree on moving forward. So I think that's another way that I've seen as an editor the types of papers that those different types, but that's the last type of paper that I certainly enjoy reading and publishing.
Okay. So James and Paul, as I mentioned earlier, are short course instructors and over the years their courses have been in the area of multi-level analysis. And so I'm wondering from your experience in that area whether there are kinds of aspects of multi-level theory and analysis that are particularly misunderstood by your typical organizational or psychological research. So what I'm trying to do is save all the really hard questions for me first.
Oh, so I'm going first. That's a good question. Yeah, you jump in first.
I'll let you give
me a minute.
Because I actually have two ideas on this one too. So the
now you have all this academic time. You got ideas.
Yeah.
Right. So the one that I see with some frequency in there is relatively misunderstood. In fact, if you look at my own publications, I'm probably guilty of doing this myself, and that is within the multi-level literature, one of the things that you can do is you can put in a group level attribute and you can regress an individual outcome on this group level attribute, right? This is kind of one of the key features of that. So I can look at individual well-being and I can look at the average work hours in a group as one of the predictors in that equation. Well, that's often described both theoretically as being a how does a group level predictor explain an individual level outcome? And if you look at the data, that all makes sense, right? You've got the individual outcomes, you're using the variable collected at the lowest level, you've assigned the group mean back to each individual. But Preacher and others have been very clear in pointing out that a group level predictor can only explain the average of your individual outcome. So if you're interpreting and thinking about setting up your theory, you should really be saying things like the average level of work hours in a group is related to the average well-being. And so that setup and the way that people describe it and interpret that finding I repeatedly see is not aligned. I mean, people don't align their theory with actually what's being done analytically on that. And it's partly because again, it looks like you should have a group level predictor be able to predict an individual level outcome, and people have described it as that. And the other thing that I see a lot is that it's difficult when you first do multi-level analysis to get your head around the idea of a random term. What do we actually mean when we say we're going to treat this variable as random? And so the examples in the literature are often you have individuals who are invested within classrooms and you have 100 classrooms. And you're not trying to say anything specific about any one classroom. Or in the Army, you've got 100 different companies and you're not trying to say anything about Alpha Company and then 5 second to 700 companies. And so that becomes random. But I find that concept of what's a random term is confusing to people when they first start dealing with multi-level models. So they want to treat gender as random, which is generally more effective as a fixed effect. So those are two. I think enough time to think.
Yeah, I've come up with something. So I agree with Paul on the second point. I don't necessarily, he hasn't convinced me on the first one. But on the second point, one of the things that I try to emphasize when I teach the multi-level course is the distinction between random variables, random effects, random coefficients. These are terms that get tossed around a lot, but people don't really understand what they mean. And so I certainly try to use some of my time to make sure that we understand what those terms mean. Another thing that I've seen in multi-level, it's not so much, I guess, a problem as it is a promise, something that I see as promising and looking exciting going forward, are two things. One, there's been some work done now where people have tried, Paul described the prototypic multi-level model, where you have a group level attribute trying to exert a downward influence on some individual level outcome. But there's been some work done now where you take individual level predictor variables and try to examine how they might exert an upward causal influence on some outcome. I think those models are very interesting and promising. They need work, but there's some pretty, I think, cool stuff happening in that area. And then the other area that I'm pretty excited about, I wish I had accepted the paper, but Jose Cortina accepted the paper. It's a paper that Steve Kozlowski and a number of his colleagues published last year in ORM, and it won a Best Paper Award. But Steve and his colleagues went back and really tried to unpack this issue of emergence. And for those of you that are familiar with multi-level, the idea of emergence is really that there is we think in terms of levels, there might be a certain construct that originates at, say, an individual level, but it emerges temporally, over time, dynamically, through interactions with one another. It emerges into some sort of group level construct. So I might have individual perceptions of my work environment, we'll call that psychological climate, but over time, a group of individuals come to have a sense of shared agreement, and we would say this organization or this work team has a particular climate. And I think what Steve's article and his colleagues' article did was it pointed out the reality that we study emergence as a byproduct, as something that's happened. So we don't study emergence as it occurs and as it unfolds longitudinally or dynamically. We study emergence after it's emerged. So we study climate not as newcomers to an organization and tracking their perceptions of their work environment, modeling their social interactions with one another and the social networks they develop, and examining how different patterns of interactions and how different time variables and how different shocks to the system based upon environmental shocks, how that shapes the emergence of a collective variable. We just simply wait 6 months and then go in and measure the collective variable, and if everybody agrees, we say there's a shared perception, the constructs emerge, and we move on. And so what Steve's article really is challenging, I think, our field to do is to think about the concept at a theoretical level of emergence, but then to also think about what are the implications for things like measurement and how are we going to track these things longitudinally. And a lot of what has been done in the kind of emergence sort of domain has been done qualitatively, which is good and it's useful and it provides important information. But a number of researchers that want to study emergence are quantitative. And so he really kind of spells out what are the ways that we can look at things quantitatively. And it's a combination of using, in essence, kind of computational simulations and then validating those computational simulations with actual longitudinal field studies. So I don't know that I see it as a problem that we study emergence as a byproduct of other things, but I think it's exciting to think about unpacking that further.
Yeah. That paper that James is mentioning actually was the basis of a CARMA webcast that Steve gave, and we also have my interview with him as part of the Methodologist that's on our CARMA YouTube channel as well. Well, as you might have gathered, I know these guys for a long time, and we always have a lot of fun hanging out. And hanging out is certainly an end worthy of its own, but you are here to do the webcast. And so can you just talk a little bit about the webcast that you're going to give later today?
I can do that. That's let me handle that hard question. Yeah, so the talk that I'm going to be giving this afternoon is focused on some practical suggestions, some practical recommendations for researchers that might be interested in understanding how to better measure implicit or automatic or unconscious aspects of people. I'm going to focus on personality and personality motives. And there's been several previous CARMA webcasts that were on similar topics by Larry James. And in those talks, he really kind of introduced this particular measurement system that we've been working on called conditional reasoning, and then illustrated examples of it. Here's how we can use conditional reasoning to measure aggression or power. And what the types of questions I tend to get are, how do you write an item, or how do I estimate? My reliability seems to be much lower than I would hope that it is. How do you guys estimate reliability? So the focus of my talk is going to really be on these items and writing these items, because they're not a traditional kind of self-report item. They are inductive reasoning problems, but they're kind of clever inductive reasoning problems that have multiple correct answers. And we call it conditional reasoning because the extent to which one answer is viewed as the correct answer compared to another answer being viewed as the correct answer, is conditional on the personality of the reasoner. And so people with certain personalities tend to invoke a series of cognitive biases, a series of kind of information processing filters that impact how they solve these problems. But how to write these problems is tricky. And how do you write a problem and then embed the kind of the personality differences in the answers is tricky. So I'm going to talk about a number of different things very briefly, but the primary bulk of the time is going to be devoted to talking about inductive reasoning items and how to harness the inductive item format as a mechanism for measuring aspects of the psychology.
James mentioned that his talk will be based on work done over the years by Larry James, and you may know that tragically Larry passed away not that long ago, and in fact, if you're a member of PSYOP, you may have seen the obituary and the comments about Larry and his career that were made in Jose's president of PSYOP, his commentary. You may know Larry got the, just last May, got the Distinguished Career Contribution Scholarship Award from PSYOP. And so Larry was a long-time contributor to CARMA, and so just it worked out by chance that James is here, and his is the 100th webcast. And so what we're doing is we're recognizing James' webcast, James LeBreton webcast, formally with the title of the CARMA James Memorial Lecture. And from here on out, every first year, the first webcast lecture of the year will be named that. So it's a little bit of background. Paul, what are you going to be talking about?
Well, I was originally going to talk about the utility of doing randomized experimentation within organizational settings. So when I started to work on that, I realized that I can't talk about putting everyone to sleep. So then I came up with the, very ingenious and clever idea of trying to do 10 different ideas to celebrate 10 years of CARMA.
There you go.
And in fact, actually, I thought it was 15. So when I started this with Larry, because you've actually been doing CARMA for 15 years, but it's been 10 years as a webcast. So I had to come up with 15 ideas, and then when Larry told me it was only 10, then I was like, oh, that's awesome.
So you can pick the top 10.
I could pick the top 10. So, but the theme that I thought with this particular one is just pick 10 different ideas that are loosely related. I have them in a couple of themes within there. Ideas about ways, things that you can do that might help potentially develop your skills as an analyst, might help convey the results of different organizations is one thing. And then the other key theme is themes that have to do with increasing the rigor of what we do. And so there are just different topics on here about the utility of simple simulations, both from the practitioner point of view, from using simulations within organizations to convey methods to them, the utility of looking at your data, and also then kind of counter with the utility of looking at your data but not over-interpreting your data, the utility of things like the bootstrap, and just describing some of the concepts of the non-parametric bootstrap and why it's useful. And so these are just kind of thought ideas, 10 different thought ideas that will hopefully be of interest to people and disperse something. I don't think these are going to be particularly novel or unique, right? I mean, I've borrowed a lot of these from others. I think they're just things that have come up over the years. But it's a way, I thought it'd be a way to throw some ideas out there and see if any of these kind of stuff can generate some interest.
Okay. Well, you might gather neither one of these guys are as old as I am, but you have been doing it for a while. And so my next question to you is, how is it that you stay fresh? How is it that you maintain the drive and the interest in what you do that's necessary to maintain sustained performance at the levels that you've been on?
One of the best pieces of advice I ever received was from Larry James when I was in graduate school. And his advice was you should only do research on things that you were just fascinated by and you find completely interesting. If you're doing research on something because that's what your advisor does research on, that may be a necessary evil to get through the program. But hopefully there's somebody else in the program that does something that might be a little bit more interesting. But Larry never got bored with his work, ever. He just was always interested, and it was always refreshing to talk with him, because any time I was feeling just kind of worn out or down on something, got a bad review or whatever, I could call him, and it would just be like this instantaneous pick-me-up, because, we'd start talking about other things we were working on, and, it was very easy to focus on kind of the positive side of things, because these were things that I was really curious about. If you find an article coming out and you feel obligated to read it, as opposed to excited to read it, then that topic probably isn't the topic that's going to keep you charged and keep you fresh and keep you doing things. If an article comes out and you can't wait to read it because you think it's really relevant to what you're doing and might help shape your thinking or help you revise your thinking or improve your thinking, then you're probably in the sweet spot that you want to be in terms of really being able to work on things that are exciting. I'm biased. I think that the job that I have is the best job in the world. I get paid a decent amount of money to work with really smart people, graduate students that are appreciably smarter than I am, and very clever, and get to work with smart colleagues, and it's on things that I find fascinating and interesting. And if you're having any question about whether you should take the academic path or the applied path, my bias is take the academic path. You get to do basically research on anything that you want, and you get to work with people that are just as excited about it.
Professor?
I would mirror a lot of what James said. I mean, I think you definitely know you're in the zone when it's something that you're doing that's fun, right? I mean, these are the things that, when you lie awake at night at 3 o'clock in the morning, first lecture, most of everyone is wrong, and you start switching over. The questions, the empirical ones, like, I wonder what would happen if, right? I mean, I don't know how to explain it, but there are just certain topics that are, of interest to you as you go through it. And so if you find that those topics, if there are things in there that you want to read, that are happening in there, then that's a great area to go to. The other thing I'd add to that is, a lot of it's the colleagues. I mean, there's kind of two things. Get a group of colleagues who are, always keep in mind this isn't really a competition, everyone kind of treats it as one, but you'll enjoy this job a whole lot more if you have a group of friends and people that you work with that share your interests, and you realize that all of you can win at this game. You don't have to, you don't win by somebody else losing at it. And so those are just, and your colleagues will bring interesting ideas too. Everyone probably goes through their career times where they're really excited about something and then this peters out for whatever reason because they couldn't find the evidence for it. But if you've got a group of people who are feeding you information and you're talking about different things and new ideas coming to you, you can contribute to it. And I think in particular, if you have an interest in methods, you have the ability then to be involved in just a ton of interesting things because there is a relatively small percentage of people within our field who are really geared toward the methods world. And so there's always a demand for somebody who can take a fresh look at some data that somebody else has put their life in collecting, and you can get interested and actually help them by applying a new analytic approach to something that somebody feels very passionate about. That's rewarding for you to try something new.
And can I add one thing to that real quick?
Sure.
And just the only other thing I would say is another great piece of advice that comes out of what Paul's saying is if you have colleagues that you're collaborating with, even if they're not collaborating with you on a particular paper, the best thing you can do, at least for those of you that are younger and getting started, is just have a group of people that you agree to review each other's work. Getting a fresh set of eyes on something is so important. And so if you can have your paper peer reviewed by 1 or 2 people before you send it out for a journal, you've probably doubled the chances that it's not going to get desk rejected. You've probably at least doubled the chances that it's going to make it past the editor's desk and out for review, that's half the battle at a lot of these journals is just getting it out for review. And so I think having colleagues that at least are in the same general area, even if you're not collaborating on papers, just agree to review each other's work and you agree to turn it around in 1 week. If they send you something, I'll review whatever Paul sends me in a week and he'll review whatever I send him in a week. Then you've got that mutual relationship to kind of support one another.
Okay. Last question. So as I mentioned earlier, you've been a frequent contributor to CARMA over the years, both in terms of coming back for repeated webcast, and also your involvement in short course instructors. So you're going on at noon, you're going on at 1:30. What's going to be going through your head in like the last 30 minutes as you approach giving your CARMA webcast lecture?
Well, I think, yeah, I think no matter how long you do this kind of work and you make presentations and things like that, there's always a certain degree of anxiety associated with thinking it through, trying to think through it. And, for any kind of presentation like a webcast or one of these other things, often, to tell you the truth, where I focus on are what I think of as the transitions. And this is actually something that the artist told me in terms of our presentation. That is, each slide is transitioning to the next slide, and often slides are transitioning ideas. And so when I think about giving a talk, I'm often thinking about what's that transition? How am I smoothly going from this idea to the next idea on there? So 30 minutes before I do it, I'll quickly go back through the whole thing and just kind of make mental notes about, oh, here would be a nice way to transition from this idea to this idea, and keep it going along those lines. So I would also say that it's always important to do dry runs on this. Before I came up here, I asked you if we're down there in South Carolina if I could just treat this like a conference and give the whole thing. And I asked them for the feedback. I said, does this work? You did it, or you lost here? I got great feedback from the graduate students and then other faculty who said, no, this is, you lost me here, or you could do this, do that. So again, it doesn't matter kind of how long you've done it. It's always good to get feedback with the manuscripts and presentations.
Connect the dots.
Connect the dots.
James?
I'm not as punctual and reliable as Paul, so I was frantically working on my slides just a few days ago. So I did not have an opportunity to present my talk to my colleagues at Penn State, but my lovely wife had the opportunity to sit next to me downstairs in the basement and listen to an abbreviated version of the talk. And so we got to several slides, and my wife is trained as a psychologist, and she's familiar with my work, but she's not embedded in this area. So she's educated on the topic. And so we get into some of these slides, and she's like, I have no idea what is on these slides, and why do you even have this slide, and what does this mean? And I'm like, it's so obvious, how can you not understand? And so she was right and I was wrong, because I couldn't explain to it why I had the slides that way, and so I was able to go back and tweak those slides. So hopefully the talk will not, people will not have a similar reaction if I liked it. But I think having someone look at the slides and make sure that things are smooth is a good thing. When I go, before I give a talk like this, I think same thing. Paul, you look at your slides, you want to make sure that some of the transitions aren't what's on the slide, it's what you're going to say between them. Most of it is not on the slide, it's what you're going to say between the slides. And so you don't, hopefully I won't have too many slides pop up where I'm like, oh, why is that there? You want to have the kind of smooth talk there. In terms of anxiety, I don't tend to get too anxious when I give these talks in general, but I think when it comes to the CARMA talks are unique in the sense that there's this very tight time window that we're supposed to adhere to. And so the challenge always is, do I have enough material to get me through the 60 minutes that I'm supposed to talk? I don't want to talk for 25 minutes and then be sitting there like a fool and not having done what Larry asked me to do. But at the same time, you don't want to have so much material that you don't have a chance to cover the important topics as well. So I get a little anxious, less about content, and you can quite the same way, less about the content that I'm talking about, and more about the timing and the continuity and making sure that I achieve in the talk what Larry has asked me to try to achieve. And then this talk is special for me because it's on a topic, my research program with Larry James. And Larry was my mentor in graduate school. He was a collaborator on many projects. He was a good friend. And so he died of stuff, and it's nice to have a chance to talk.
Well, we are very appreciative of your efforts for CARMA over the years, and as two of my dearest friends, it's extra special to have you guys here to celebrate our 10th year and for you to honor Larry and give your lecture. So I appreciate you
Thank you
taking
for
the
having
time,
me.
taking the time this morning to share your thoughts. Again, CARMA webcast lectures, and you can find more information about what we do, not only on the CARMA website, but let me invite you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, and this interweb's a wonderful thing, and the fact that we've been able to create a kind of a process or an infrastructure to allow so many different people from so many different locations to have access to good people like this to improve the process of science. That's something that's been real special to be involved in. So thanks so much and enjoy your day.